I am Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of what is the least expensive autofocusing 85mm lens that I have seen yet to date on the Sony E-mount platform, and that is the Meike 85mm F1.8 STM. Yes, this is a lens designed for mirrorless, an autofocusing lens, 85mm lens for full frame cameras, in this case Sony E-mount cameras, and it comes at a price point of $199 US, which makes it about twice as cheap as the cheapest competing lens that I've reviewed previously, which was the Viltrox 85mm F1.8 STM. And so that makes it obviously a really intriguing lens from a value perspective. The big question, of course, is it still an intriguing lens after you've actually spent time using, or in my case, reviewing it? The answer is actually yes. This lens can produce some surprisingly sophisticated images, and at such a cheap price point is certainly going to be intriguing for those of you that are on a very tight budget. It's by no means the top performing 85mm lens that I've tested. I've probably tested at least a dozen of them on Sony at this point, but at this price point, it is obviously considerably cheaper than any of the others. So today we're going to dive in, we're going to look at autofocus, we're going to look at build and features, we're going to look at the image quality in detail and help you determine whether this is a lens that you should consider if you own a Sony camera and you're on a tight budget. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
The Meike 85 STM stands out as being lightweight at 356 grams or 12.2 ounces, but not for being small. I was quite surprised when I pulled out my Sigma 85mm F1.4 DN and found that while the Sigma was considerably heavier, the physical difference in size between the two lenses was not significant. The Meike is the largest of the four 85mm F1.8 lenses for Sony that I compared, with a diameter of 80mm, 3.15 inches, and a length of 92mm, 3.62 inches. The Sony 85mm F1.8 wins for the most compact of the quartet, though the Meike wins for being the lightest. I had to use some of my own physical measurements and weight for the Meike after finding some minor variance from numbers I found posted online. The reason for that larger than expected size is made clear when I look in the back of the lens and find a significant cavity before the glass of the rear element. I've noted that Meike had previously had an Canon EF and Nikon F mount versions of this lens, and I suspect that they have ported this lens to the mirrorless Sony E-mount, much like Sigma did with their earliest full-frame lenses for Sony. Making that transition requires the optical path to move forward for proper focus and leaves what is essentially the depth of an adapter built into the length of the lens. A look at the rear also shows a welcome inclusion. That is a USB-C port built into the mount that will allow for firmware updates without any kind of dock or accessory. That helps to keep the lens up to date and also allows them to make some tweaks on the fly to things like focus. If you look at the front of the lens, you see a lot of glass inside, which is always a welcome sight, and a very common 67mm front filter thread. The lens is made from engineered plastics that feel slightly cheaper than those used in more expensive lenses, though the lens doesn't feel overly plasticky either. The included lens hood is petal-shaped and quite deep, which is good because the lens ends up needing it. The Meike does have an AF/MF switch, which is always welcome, as I find it still the most direct way to control changing between those functions. The only other feature on the lens barrel is the focus ring, which does feel a little more plastic than many focus rings and moves with very little weight. I found that manual focus action as a byproduct of that is a little lifeless, though I did find on Sony that I got automatic focus assist, which is the magnification of the active area focus, which is always welcome. Minimum focus distance is 85 centimeters, or about 3 feet, which is about 5 centimeters longer than average, which results in a below average amount of magnification at that distance. The lens has 9 curved aperture blades inside, and one thing I did note is some sound when the aperture changes, far more than what I ever heard for focus sound. But you can see from this photo that even at f4, the bokeh highlights are nice and round. As expected, at a lens that only costs $200, there is no weather sealing nor image stabilization. There is some coatings on the front element, however, that are supposed to make it easier to clean. So while build quality is not top-notch, obviously, this is quite a decent lens for this price point. So as you can see, really a lot of decent things on the lens. It has, a few more features than what I would expect. AF/MF switch, ability to do firmware updates. And while obviously it is a little bit larger than what it needs to be, it is still lightweight, and it's obviously not onerously big at the same time. And so still a lens that you could throw even onto an APS-C body, where you're going to get somewhere close to 135mm angle of view, which is obviously still very useful. So how about that autofocus? I've actually only reviewed manual focus lenses from Meike in the past, so I was really intrigued to see how they did when it came to the STM, or stepping focus motor. And I was actually pleasantly surprised for the most part, with one minor exception, which I'll detail in just a moment. But overall, I found autofocus to be quiet. I noted previously that there is some noise when the aperture changes, but very little noise associated with autofocus. And the autofocus speed was, if not top-notch, was plenty fast for most things. And in fact, I really kind of put it to the test by testing some focus action while doing some tennis. And so I did burst, and I found that actually the lens did really good. In over hundreds of shots, there were very few misfocused, and most of them were, I would say, pretty much perfectly focused. And so it showed the ability, at least with that speed of action, to be able to keep up just fine. And basically the only time I saw focus misses was really when the subject's eyes were turned away from the camera, like when hitting a backhand swing, for example. But overall, autofocus stayed really good and stayed on track there, even at high-speed burst on my Alpha 1. I also saw good focus results on my Sony a7 IV, whether that was in a church setting or I put it in my wife's hands for a little birthday celebration for myself. And even though she's not an experienced photographer, there were well-focused results because IAF did its job, locked on, and just gave very good autofocus. I also found that out in the field with narrow depth of field shots, autofocus was also very good in that setting. As I noted, there was only one area where I was disappointed, and that was actually shooting at smaller apertures, at least in one setting, where I was trying to track a beautiful cabin cruiser that was coming across the water. And so as I was trying to, track its not all that fast moving action, but against a background at smaller apertures like f5.6, because I wanted to keep the background also in some degree of focus, I found that I did some pulsing back and forth, and if I, caught it at the wrong moment, I got a shot like this, where what I was looking for was a shot more like this. Now, ironically, I couldn't always recreate that in other settings, and even in that same kind of setting with just trying to shoot the landscape background, I got perfectly focused results. So go figure. At the end of the day, though, I think that this is something that maybe Meike could address via firmware in the future, and just to help with that smaller aperture pulsing that you might run into. Overall, however, I give it really good marks because, again, for a lens that costs $200, this is a relatively sophisticated focus system, and even more so when I consider that Meike hasn't been doing autofocus for very long. So how about the image quality? Let's dive in and let's take a look in detail.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You definitely can see a bit of vignette here and a very minimal amount of pincushion distortion. To achieve that end result, I only used a -3 to correct for the distortion and only a +29 for the vignette. So we're talking about just barely over one stop or around one stop in the corners. Nothing significant at all there. So a little bit of a mixed bag when it comes to longitudinal chromatic aberrations. You can see here in the transition here that there is a little bit of fringing in this high contrast area between the dark of the hair and then the bright of the screen. A little bit of purple fringing here before the plane of focus, but really nothing extreme for that kind of setting. Likewise here, that if we go outdoors, you can see again there's a minimal amount of fringing, here around some of these white contrast edges. But the biggest thing that I see above all is just mostly just a not amazing contrast at f1.8, but overall the upside of that, of course, is that the background is really soft and creamy. So I suspect that there are some of you that would say that's a fair trade-off there. Likewise here, there is a little bit of purple fringing before the plane of focus. You can see just a little bit here. Not much in terms of after the plane of focus. It's pretty neutral, but before the plane of focus, there is some of that purple fringing. And really this image here, actually at f2.8, was probably the worst that I saw. And that's more, if you put it in really high contrast lighting with some really shiny reflective surfaces, like here, you can see some fringing along in those areas. But, you know, and I've seen that before with other 85mm lenses, that they actually test quite well, but then in some real world high contrast situation, there's a bit more fringing. But I certainly wouldn't call the fringing in this a deal breaker. Lateral chromatic aberrations, which you find at any aperture value along the edge of the frame, there really isn't a whole lot to speak about here. I don't see anything that I even consider worthy of correction in this contrast area here, and so I wouldn't worry much about that. If we look at the other side of the frame, same thing is here. You just really don't see a whole lot of fringing, maybe a tiny bit there, but I don't think enough to where you're going to even worry about correcting that, because if you can barely see it at a pixel level, you'll never see it in a full image. So how about the resolution and contrast? Well, we've already seen some indications that contrast is not going to be top-notch at f1.8, but here, look at the test chart. This is on the 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1. This is a 200% magnification, so it really shows off any kind of flaw. So you can see, yes, resolution is quite good in the center of the frame. Contrast is not top-notch. Mid-frame resolution has slipped a little bit, but still looks fairly good here. And you can just see, however, that contrast is not off the chart. We look down towards the edge of the frame. You can see that, you know, there is a transition over that last few percentage points, in that here it's still pretty decent. By the time we get to the edge of the frame, it is considerably softer. But what you see even more so is that there is less contrast towards the corner of the frame. Now, in a real-world image at f1.8, and this is, I would say that contrast on a global level looks, you know, perfectly fine. You can see that Loki stands out nicely there, and his friend, who is not really a friend, if you know what I mean. Anyhow, but you can see that if I zoom into a pixel level, you can just see that the contrast is not intense, but at the same time, it's a very acceptable result, and the overall global look of the image is quite nice here, even at f1.8. Now, with some lenses, stopping from f1.8 to f2 makes a difference. Other lenses, it's basically no difference at all. Here we can see there is some improvement when it comes to contrast, and interestingly enough, the image metered the same between f1.8 and f2. But we can see that there is a mild amount of improvement when it comes to contrast that you can even see here into the corner. And so you kind of have to make a decision. It may be worth shooting at f2 just for that little bit of a boost that you get in performance without a whole lot of cost to depth of field or light gathering. You'll find a more significant jump going to f2.8, however, and now you can see that in the center of the frame, the lens is actually very sharp and contrast is very good. And so it's made a pretty huge leap at f2.8. Likewise here in the mid frame, again, it's not as exceptional as it is in the center of the frame, but you can see the mid frame sharpness is coming along nicely. And even if we go back down here towards the corner, you can see that the corner is significantly improved, and not only improved as far as extending resolution a little bit further out, but you can see that that contrast is really clearing up, and the textures are looking much crisper here at f2.8. Stop on down to f4, and now even the corners are extremely sharp, and so you get a very nice end result there at f4. And if we look here, mid-frame is incredibly sharp, as is f4 looks really fantastic. So there is actually a lot of resolution on tap here that'll extend all across the frame if you stop on down. We've reached close to a peak by f4, but you can see at f5.6 there is just a little bit more contrast available in the mid-frame. You know, it just looks that tiny degree better at f5.6, pretty close to a kind of peak performance there. And so it's a minimal gain from f4 to f5.6, but there is a little bit of an extra gain in terms of contrast available there. And surprisingly, as you stop on down to f8, at least in the corners, it looks better still. And so by f8, you are hitting what I would consider the maximum result across the frame. And so if you look back in the center of the frame, the center isn't necessarily sharper, but it is just a more consistent performance across the frame, going from f5.6 to f8. And most noticeable here as you get towards the edge of the frame, where it's just a little bit higher contrast at the edge. Now, our minimum aperture is f22, but as per usual, you can see that f22 looks softer even than what f1.8 wide open does, and that is due to the effects of diffraction, particularly on a high-resolution body. Arguably, the corners are the only place where it looks better at f22, but I would use f16 as a practical limit, f11 even better. Now you can see at f5.6 on a pixel level that it looks really fantastic. I mean, really good contrast and detail here across the frame. And right off to the edge, you can see that while it's not as good as the center, it is still very, very good on both sides of the image with, good resolution right out there towards the edge of the frame. Now, as noted, minimum focus distance of 85 centimeters is no record breaker. It's below average, as is the amount of magnification. I estimated it about 0.10, 0.11, very low. But on a positive note, I really feel like the result is pretty decent up close with contrast not looking too bad. And you can see a pretty good flat plane of focus to where you do have, resolution all across the frame. So the flat plane of focus is probably helped by, being a little bit further away, but as a byproduct, while you can't get a lot of magnification, you can get a nice up close end result. Case in point here, whereas the image is, not mind-blowingly sharp here at our plane of focus up close, it really has blurred out that background beautifully, and I think that the overall look of the image is quite lovely. Another shot here in a similar fashion. If you look in at a pixel level, there's plenty of detail there, I think, for most people in most situations, but I'm most impressed by how soft and creamy the background is for such a low-budget lens. Even here where there's potential for a busier background with the autofocus areas being closer, it still looks really nice and clean. And then, even here where it's a much more complex scene with some bare edges, it really doesn't look too bad. And frankly, colors look quite good here, as does our detail and contrast at this distance. So, consider me impressed in that regard. This image too, where there's a lot of potential for busyness. I was just trying to see, kind of testing focus, isolating a subject here, but you can see that it did a really nice result, a nice job of focusing, and then the defocused background is really not bad at all. Likewise here, colors look pretty rich to me out of that image. Again, for a budget lens, that's pretty nice looking color. One final image to show that off here, and so here you can see that the detail at, I believe this is either f4 or f5.6, but detail looks really good. But if we step back and just look at the image globally, colors are very nice. Now, one area that I noted of vulnerability is that this lens is, it's pretty susceptible to flare. And so even in this image, you can see it's not the sun, it's actually just kitchen lights that are behind my head here. You can definitely see that veiling pattern that's coming down. Now, in this case, I actually think the look is an artistic, maybe even desirable one, but that's obviously not always going to be the case. And so getting that veiling where you lose contrast is not going to be great. Maybe getting some veiling on my hairline is a good thing, some might argue, but nonetheless, that is one thing to watch out for. You're going to want to use the lens hood. You're going to want to be careful also where you point this lens if you want to retain contrast in the frame.
So all told, that's really a pretty decent image quality performance, and I would say that the overall look of the images is better than expected, mostly because the quality of the background blur and also the color saturation seems really nice for such a bargain optic. And so I think that you're going to be able to use this lens for portraiture, for example, and really be pleased with the results you're going to get even at such a low price point. You might want to be careful, however, when you're backlighting your subject or shooting into the sun, because it is a bit flare prone, as we saw. At the end of the day, however, though, if you're on a tight budget, this is a lot of lens for the money. And frankly, I would be hard pressed to try to recommend an autofocusing option that's going to give you a better price to performance ratio if you're on a tight budget. And so that makes it definitely really intriguing for those of you that maybe spent all of your money on a camera and now are trying to add some lenses at a budget, or maybe you don't shoot this kind of focal length, this kind of lens all the time, and you'd like to dabble with it, but you don't want to make a big investment. The Meike 85mm F1.8 STM might just be the lens for you. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review, also to an image gallery, so you can look at more photos there. There are some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and of course, linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to purchase channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.